pleased to introduce Professor David Clowney, who is indeed a professor of philosophy, full professor of philosophy as of this year, at Rowan University. He came to Rowan in 1988, has been with us for, what does that make it now, 25 years? No.
27.
27, because I can do math, or not. And we're just, absolutely thrilled to have him every year. And he's going to speak to us today on the subject of whether or not we lack character. Do we lack character? Social psychology and the virtues. And with that said, I'd like to turn it over to David.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ed. I want to thank Ed in particular, not just for organizing all of the series, but also for doing all of the posters, which are some of the best ones on campus. All Ed knew was my topic and maybe any conversations we might have had about stuff I was working on, maybe not because I've been on sabbatical. And he just nailed it with this poster, for which I am very grateful. In case you can't see it, which is highly likely because it's kind of dim and the lights are kind of bright, this is an 18th century painting of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Here is the Samaritan. Here is the poor wounded traveler who has just been beaten up by the thieves and is lying there naked and wounded. Over to the left, where you can only see its nose, is the donkey. And way back here in the background, which you cannot possibly discern from where you are sitting, are the priest and the Levite walking by on the other side of the road. I just wanted to point those features out. We will return to this image a bit later in the talk because it relates to a famous experiment in social psychology done on the Princeton University campus and modeled after the parable of the Good Samaritan. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. What I'm doing today is part of a larger project that I've been working on my sabbatical and will be working on for, I fear, a substantial period of time. Writing a book whose working title is The Way We Are, Collective Character, and Environmental Crisis. And as you can tell from the title, I'm using the notion of virtue in order to address environmental problems as part of a general trend within virtue ethics and environmentalism to have some environmental virtue ethics. And so, of course, if it turns out that virtue ethics is based on a mistake, my whole project goes down the tubes. I would have to reinvent it rather drastically. And yet, there are some recent challenges by a couple of philosophers, Gilbert Harman and John Doris in particular, that maintain exactly that virtue ethics is based on a mistake, that the mistake has now been revealed to us by the work of social psychologists, particularly those social psychologists who call themselves situationists, and that in fact human beings do not have stable, robust, globally expansive traits of character of the sort that we have come to extend, that we have come to think of the virtues as being. We think we do. We attribute them all the time. We think our actions are based on them, but this is all an illusion. That's what Harman and Doris say, and I'll get to a little bit more of what they say in a minute. But before getting to the criticism and to my response to it, and of course there have been lots of attacks on virtue ethics, and I can't deal with all of them. This, besides being a relatively new one, that might be a reason to pay attention to it. I think, and I hope to try to at least give a hint of how I will show, that not only does this challenge fail, but actually it leads to precisely the kind of thing I'm engaged in, which is emphasizing collective character and the relationship of individual and collective character, and the strength of the social psychology evidence. And I am not going to try to debunk that at all. I think it's very sound and strong. Points to that relationship and shows the individualism of the recent revival of virtue ethics, which is a fault that its ancient predecessors did not share, and that the modern versions need to correct. In order to frame this, I think I ought to give you well, let me go back there, because I've got to, let you enjoy John Doris's cover for his book, Lack of Character. A nice picture of fragmented personality, which he thinks is characteristic of us. Interesting book. And there's the challenge. Okay. But I think I need to frame it, and I'll try to zip through the virtue ethics piece really quickly, because mostly you guys already know it. But it is being recorded, so let's just, here's the outline of what I will do, and let's just quickly run through what a virtue is. There's Aristotle. It's his way of doing ethics. It's experiencing a big revival. You always, for any ethical theory, want to ask what's the basic question they're trying to answer and what's the basic answer that they give. And the rest should unfold from there. And in Aristotle's case, it's not, what's right and wrong or what gives the best results. It's what's the best life for human beings. And the answer should be, according to him, a life that fulfills the potential of our nature. And anything, any living thing ought to be fulfilled if it is fulfilling its nature. This seems almost like a truism. And so our nature is that we are rational social animals. And that means that we ought to have the excellences of such a creature, the traits that enable us to live that kind of a life well. And excellence is a virtue. That's what the Greek word means. And if something has a function or a characteristic activity, then its virtues or its arete, arete, are the features that enable it to carry out that function well. Having a sharp blade for a knife, playing music well for being a musician. Notice that you can have functions for human beings in particular roles that they can have the excellences for those functions without being good as human beings. But a moral virtue is a virtue that you need in order to be good as a human being. So, what are the excellences of character that enable us to live as rational social animals? Well, okay. They're going to be based in our nature. We'll find it fulfilling to acquire and exercise them. The big four for Aristotle and the Greeks are, and it's good enough to just go with them, are courage, moderation, justice, and practical wisdom. And, because they're natural or easy, not necessarily. They're hard. They're according to nature, but not by nature. And in particular, the difficulty is pointed to by Aristotle of, the control of the animal part of the nature by the rational choice part of the nature without squashing the animal part. We need its energy. But its energy has a way of taking control of us and picking us up and shaking us like a dog shakes a bone from time to time. I've got experience of that at home, and there it goes up in the air and whatever that the dog is playing with, and we don't want that either. And so we must acquire these habits from the outside in, and they're all going to involve some self-control and some wisdom. In particular, they're all going to involve wisdom. Here's this example. You might remember seeing these slides before, some of them, because I used them in a previous talk. It's just the background on virtue ethics. Here's a courageous woman. You can't tell. This could be anything. But she's sticking her head in the mouth of a lion. But she knows what she's doing. She's done it many times. The lion is trained. She's taking a risk. It's courageous. It takes courage to do it. But she's also, she knows when the lion is not feeling very well and that it is not time to try this. Okay? And it's not just natural temperament, courage, but it's an acquired trait, according to Aristotle. You can have a natural, adventurous temperament or a natural timid temperament. That's the material you work with, but you can still have the virtue of courage. And just a couple of extra points. Practical wisdom is part of all the virtues, and Aristotle thinks that if you've got any virtue, you've got practical wisdom, and if you've got practical wisdom, that's going to mean that you've got all the virtues, so the virtues are unified. And this is a thing people talk about, about the unity of the virtues. Do we have it? Is there such a thing? Is there not? But the other thing, and this is the point that I'm going to emphasize today, that I think has not been emphasized very well. Some people do. Alistair MacIntyre has a pretty strong emphasis on the communal nature of the virtues. But a lot of virtue ethicists, while they'll talk about us being social animals, don't do that much with it. But we've got the virtues together. We acquire them by imitating others and by good laws. The good laws that are meant to make us good also give us the virtues. Friendship sustain them. Okay, but full virtue is rare. The many, according to Aristotle, are at best continent, which is to say, they grit their teeth and do the right thing, either because they really think they should, or because they really think they'll get whopped if they don't. Now, yeah?
What's the third way? What's the way that's rare, the one
Oh,
that's true virtue?
sorry. Okay, so the full picture is there's virtue and there's vice. And each of those is a settled characteristic where your knowledge of what is good, of the end, and your will and your emotions are integrated in such a way that you've come to enjoy doing that which you think is best, and it has become a habit, so it's natural to you.
So
that's virtue, that's rare. And vice is a settled state in the opposite direction where you've actually come to believe that what is really bad for you is good for you, and you just completely committed to it. In between there are the continent person who knows what's good and generally manages to do it, but only by gritting her teeth, and the incontinent person who knows what's good, but then when push comes to shove, just blows it and does what's bad anyway. And Aristotle has an interesting analysis of that, which we won't go into. Now, excuse me, if I don't eat this cough drop, I'm going to run out of voice before I run out of talk. So just a point about virtue ethics as a plausible theory. That a good ethical theory is normative for human behavior and not just descriptive of it, like social norms, okay? That is, it's something that you ought to do, a way you ought to be. But all the same, it has to suit us. It has to be adjusted to our nature in some way. It has to match, explain, refine, correct, systematize human moral experience. And virtue ethics does seem to do this. We think we've got character traits, we explain behavior by them, but is that picture correct? Or is virtue ethics based on a mistake? So let's look at the evidence from social psychology. And I'm going to concentrate on what the social psychologists themselves actually say. And full disclosure here, any expertise that I have on social psychology has been gained since I went on sabbatical. Before then, I didn't, if somebody asked me, what's the difference between social psychology and sociology? I couldn't have said. If somebody had asked me, name some leading social psychologists, I couldn't have done it. If somebody said, what do they do? I wouldn't have known, okay? I knew about some of the experiments. So I'm taking a lot from a book by Lee Ross and Richard Nisbett called The Person and the Situation. And Ross and Nisbett are leading social psychologists, highly respected. They've done a lot of the important experiments, and everybody in the field respects them and considers their judgment very sound. So they're good people to read if you want to find out what social psychologists are up to. And this book, which was originally written, I think, in the early 90s, has been updated with a little new preface and afterword by Ross and Nisbett in 2011. And they talk about the wrenching experience of studying social psychology. They say students who take it as an undergraduate are just fascinated by all these strange experiments and the weird things that people do. But graduate students who get to work on it all the time just simply find their whole intellectual apparatus with respect to what people are like and how they act being ripped apart. And it's very disorienting. And they come out with a completely different idea of what it is, what human beings are like. Your most basic assumptions about the causes of human behavior and the very predictability of the human world are challenged. And prominent among those assumptions is that people have traits of character which guide their behavior in a variety of circumstances, and on the basis of which we can often reliably predict what someone will do in a particular situation because that's the kind of person that she is. And if you think about, how you act and how you think, it's like that. Most of us in this room know each other well enough to think, well, that's what he's like, that's what she's like, that's the kind of thing that he or she is likely to do under these circumstances. Now, if Ross and Nisbett and the social psychologists in general were denying that there is any truth to that, they would be in trouble. And yet, if it were true in the way that we tend to think, then the social psychology experiments would give very different results. And I'll give you some examples of that in a minute, about the differences between what people predict folks will do under certain circumstances and what they actually do. So Ross and Nisbett have a way of accounting for both of those things, and the social psychologists do. And I will get to that in a minute. But they are so convinced that our habit of attributing causal efficacy to traits of character is wrong that they have given a name for that habit. They call it the fundamental attribution error. And the fundamental attribution error is explaining somebody's behavior by their character trait and not by the situation that they were in, the particular way they were reading the situation at the time, the confluence of psychological forces within them and of intention with each other, and of forces from without them, intention with them, and forces from without them, intention with each other. Which might have some particular thing that would release. Yeah.
If we know what's going
Right. I'm going to get to that, but I'll give you the quick answer, which is that there's a whole school of psychology that said that and then said, let's not try. That's a black box. We can't get inside it. Ignore it. That's called behaviorism. And yes?
Could you use, through manipulating situational factors that you can control to control behavior, could you change situation or change like an environmental factor and use that in conjunction with cognitive dissonance to make them think, oh, okay, I acted in a certain way, I must be this particular trait, when really they're not aware that what's actually influencing them is an environmental factor? Which I realize is a bit of a web that I just...
It is, and I don't want to stop to untangle it now. I'll give you what I think might be an answer to it, and if not, please come back to me at the end of the talk, because it's a very important question. Let me lay out the four, main, the four pillars. Originally it was a tripod, but now Ross and Nisbet had added a four, so they've got four pillars. They're pretty different from Ali Hushman's four pillars. But here they go. So here's the first thing that they find. The great power of the situation to shape behavior. And so if we go back to the Good Samaritan, okay, let's start with the experiment on the Princeton campus by Darley and Batson in the 70s, I believe it was, where these two experimenters picked a bunch of Princeton seminary students. And then they gave them a little survey, why are you in seminary? Why are you pursuing this course of religious instruction? Is it about wanting to help other people? Is it about, wanting to sort of secure your own salvation or your place with God, your own spiritual quest? What is it? And then they divided them into two groups. Maybe there was more than two groups, but let's just assume that it was two, because this is the relevant information. They were going to go give a talk on the other side of campus on, guess what? The Good Samaritan. All right. And so they run across, so then they're given two different sets of instructions. One is, you got plenty of time. They're probably setting up, no rush. And the other is, you're already late. Sorry about that. The experiment was running a little long, and, so you're really going to have to rush to get there on time. You may even be a couple minutes late no matter what you do. On the way, of course, they come to a plant. A guy who is sitting in a doorway, slumped over, moaning, obviously in need of help. According to Lee and Ross's account, I haven't read the Darley and Batson original, he even asks for help. What do you think happens?
Ones that were forced to rush, went to try to get there on time. The ones that weren't, helped them out.
Okay, and what percentage of the ones that weren't do you think would help?
The ones that what?
That weren't rushed.
Maybe 50%. Maybe a little.
Okay.
No, maybe 25%.
Oh, okay. in terms of the terminology that I'm learning and studying this stuff, you've been primed. Okay. All right. So the actual statistics are these. That 10% of those in a hurry helped, and 63% of those not in a hurry stopped and helped. you would think that with the seminary students, the ones that, it should have been 100%, right, regardless. You're shaking your head because you know seminary students.
Well, I know of a study, I forget who did it, but it's been replicated dozens of times, where if you take a person and you have someone who's in a legitimate position of power, say like a police officer or the president, he's not available, so we'll go to power. And he says to someone, I want you to kill that man sitting in the chair. I'll use you if you're anything, you're there. Yeah. 3 out of 4 people will do it. If a person in a legitimate position of authority tells someone, I want you to kill that person, 75% of people will do that. And the number goes up if you divide these groups based on religiosity. If they're a member of an Abrahamic faith, the number went up to 77%. However, if they're an atheist, the number went down to 11%. So,
I love it. Would you send me the link or the information, please? Clowney at Rowan.
You don't have to me holding that gun because I won't pull the trigger of it.
And this is the other thing that we think we know ourselves a lot better than we do. Because if people predicted differently than you did, but I've been priming you as to what to expect. People predicted like 80% of the people of the seminarians would help, and that they would do it. That the hurry wouldn't make any difference, but that the reason they were studying, doing religious studies would make a big difference. The reason didn't make any difference. The hurry condition made all the difference. Okay. That's the power of the situation. And there are a number of other experiments. I don't want to take a lot of time on all of them, but I'll just mention them. There are the Solomon Asch experiments. He's one of the pioneers in social psychology. Not the first one, but an important one. And he's the one that did the study about peer pressure and length of a line. So you get lines put up in front of you, and are they the same? Which ones are the same length, and which one's longer, right? And there's the poor naive subject, and everybody else is plants, and he varies the number of people who are the plants in the audience, or in the group, can you get, if everybody agrees that a line that is only half an inch long or half a foot long is the same length as a line that is a foot long, will the individual go along with the majority or hold out? And the answer is go along. But that's not the whole result, because it turns out that what the people think they were doing when they were going along is not necessarily, believing that the one line is longer than the other, but just going along to getting along, maybe. All right? Yes?
I'm just curious, do they break that down by age? Because I'm curious about age being a factor in going along and not going.
I'm not aware of whether they do or not. I know that in no case did, they did it with several individuals, and it was never the case that every single individual went along. There were always holdouts, and other accounts of it that I've read, the holdouts were, their palms had red marks from their nails pressing into them. They were sweating, and they were, because it's hard to hold out against the majority. It is really hard.
It actually registers as pain when we go against the group.
Cool.
Yeah,
I always get.
There was one trait that correlated with those who hold out in that sort of situation versus those who won't, and that was a high level of self-efficacy. Like if they felt that they could do a job well and see it through to the end, they were less likely in the end to capitulate and go along with the process. Cool.
And again, send me that, because that's really interesting, and it's obviously relevant to the topic that we're working on. A couple of I have to mention a couple of other famous experiments. But I will, here's one of them is the famous experiments by Stanley Milgram on obedience, where, people were recruited to participate in a study on learning, And then, when they get in there, what they have to do is, somebody's in another room and he's giving answers about words, and if he spells the words wrong, gives the wrong answer, then they're to give him a shock, and he's already agreed to it, and they've agreed to it, everybody knows what's going on, and then they have to keep upping the level of shock, and will they do it up to the level that's labeled XXX, dangerous, even when the guy, it was a guy, has been, banging on the wall, hollering out, "My heart, I can't stand it, please make it stop," and then there is silence, and they just keep on doing it. Now, again, not everybody does it, but the percentage is very high, and it's way higher than the percentage that people predict will do it. And the other experiment that is very famous, another one, is the experiment by Philip Zimbardo, the Stanford Prison experiment, where he recruits a bunch of students, and some of them are assigned to be guards, and some of them are assigned to be prisoners, and the prisoners are supposed to act like prisoners, and the guards are supposed to act like guards. And on the pleading of his girlfriend, now his wife, he stops it after 6 days, because the behavior of these guards in particular and the suffering of the prisoners is so outrageous, and they're becoming so horrible that he is persuaded, this is immoral, I have to make it stop. And he does. Now all of these, yes. Okay, it's very interesting. I don't know how far we'll get, but I've been really enjoying the interchange.
On the Milgram trials, they did another version of that later, where they had 2 people who were pressing the buttons to shock the guy, and if one of them was a plant, and if one of them rebelled and said, "No, I'm not going to shock the guy to the point of death. I'm not getting, then the other person would almost every time be like, "Yeah, I'm not doing it either."
That's right. No, there were many variations on that experiment. And having one rebel helped you not to do it. Being in close contact where you actually had to physically touch the person and giving the shock made it way harder to do it. Having a different person who was not considered quite so much an authority in the room pulled you back from doing it. Every one of those conditions was different. There's a lot about the Milgram experiments. They are very, very, very famous. So that's not hard to understand. But this is just the power of the situation. And also, okay, so now the next thing is the power of the situation is such that if you aggregate all these experiments and look at the evidence, you have much better luck predicting what people are going to do based on what the situation that they're in than you will by looking at what traits they supposedly have. Also, because I'm not sure I really get to this, it doesn't matter how you're deciding about the traits. It doesn't matter whether you're doing it from personal knowledge, unless you really know the person for a long period of time and the situation is a situation you've seen them in before. Then you're good at it. Otherwise, you're not. But it doesn't matter either if you've gotten the information from one of these personality inventories. Personality tests, whether designed by depth psychologists or other sorts of psychologists, are no good whatever at predicting what people are going to do. They're relatively consistent with each other and with what people think about themselves, because you get the results by having people fill out paper and pencil tests, but they do not do any good at all in predicting behavior, pretty much. Now, and this is where Doris and Harman almost get off the train. They talk about the power of the situation. They don't do much else. But the social psych picture, as I've been reading it, and I got to go back and reread Doris to be sure he doesn't, I'm giving him enough credit here. Gilbert Harman, I'm sure, because he's very cut and dried about it. That there's also the power of construal. And this is what makes the difference between a situationist social psychologist and a behaviorist. Because a situationist social psychologist understands that what the person does in a situation is going to be a function of what the person thinks the situation is. How the person interprets the situation is going to be huge. So here's this example of sexual harassment studies by another social psychologist, John Bargh, at Yale. And Bargh did some studies on how much difference linking sex with power makes in men with regard to their vulnerability to sexual harassment. Some men are wired to link sex with power, some aren't. My impression is that probably Joss Whedon is, but he's worked it out. So he's both created Buffy, the feminist hero, and bondage appears all over the place throughout that whole series. But it's very possible, you know, it often doesn't get worked out. And so, you know, the way that a man, particularly a man wired that way, who is a boss, is going to perceive the actions of a woman working for him is going to be very different from the way the woman perceives their interactions. She may be making nice, wanting to keep her job, wanting to do the right thing for her employer, right? And you know, the idea of anything sexual or romantic or any sort of personal intimacy really at all is just not on her horizon. Whereas he is seeing her smile and her courtesy as come-ons. And you know, Bargh nails this all down very nicely in some cleverly designed experiments in which no actual women were harassed. And yet, the evidence was clear. And that's just one clear example, but you can think of many, many others of the way different people read the same situation in very different ways. And also, construal can be manipulated by priming, by framing, by this funny characteristic that Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky discovered. That Kahneman's the guy, you know, Thinking Fast and Slow. Wonderful, wonderful book. But they, you know, symmetry, we all know from studying logic, is a reciprocal relationship. If A is similar or symmetrical with B, I'm sorry, if A is similar to B, then B is similar to A in the same degree. But we think that jackals are more like dogs than dogs are like jackals, because you don't put it to people that way. You just say, how similar is a dog to a jackal? And then later in the test, you say, how similar is a jackal to a dog? And you'll get different results. Why is that? It's because of the framing. Dogs are more prominent in our lives than jackals. We think more of dogs than we do of jackals. So we tend to think of the dog as the ideal or the model or the reference point, and the reference point is more important. So you think of everything as being similar to it, not the other way around, and that shows up in the numbers. That's an example of framing. Example of priming is the wonderful work another social psychologist named Jennifer Eberhardt at Stanford has been doing on racial bias, where she's a MacArthur Award-winning African-American psychologist there. She's also being called on, you know, I mean, her phone must be ringing off the hook all the time by all these police departments to please come train them on racial bias, because here's this horrible stuff happening and they're under pressure to do something and they need to and they don't know what to do. And what she does is to just show them, hey guys, you've all got racial bias. It doesn't even matter what the color of your skin is, it's still in there, buried, and it's going to come out, and if you don't recognize that you've got it and then find ways of beginning to diminish it or deal with it or address it or anticipate the effects of it, then you got trouble. And what she does is she primes people with real rapid flashed what they used to call subliminal perception images, either of black faces or white faces. And then she does a resolution test, which is a scatter dot pattern, and it gradually resolves, gets sharper and clearer until it's either a picture of a gun or a knife. And if you have been primed with the black faces, you will, most people will, resolve the image of the weapon faster than if you had not. Boom. It's in everybody, by the way. Jesse Jackson called himself out on walking down the street and feeling reassured when he realized that the guy walking toward him, was white rather than black. So, but those are examples of framing and priming. And there's also after the fact rationalization, where we want to attribute what we do to our character and to our rational choice. And so if you've got nothing to attribute it to, what you did, you will cook up a rationalization. And the example was a woman has been given under hypnotic suggestion, the idea that as she leaves the room, she's going to reach down and touch the floor. And she does it. And she's asked, why did you do that? Oh, I think I lost an earring here. Okay? Now, then, in addition to the importance of construal, of the situation and the importance of construal, there's the dynamic character of individual and social relationships and processes, tensions, a balance between things in tension, and what Ross and Nisbet call channel factors, which are things that might suddenly unleash one of those forces, causing you to snap over into a different sort of behavior than you normally would. So the guys in the Stanford Prison experiment, and by Zimbardo's account, the folks at Abu Ghraib as well, were in a situation where those tensions were altered, and there were channel factors that allowed the release of things that they otherwise would not have engaged in. I think that might be one way of accounting for what happened, both in the Stanford Prison experiment and also by Zimbardo's account in Abu Ghraib. Zimbardo also, by the way, puts a strong emphasis on culture, and Ross and Nisbet talk about that too. So he talks about the individual, the situation, and the culture, the system. He's writing in the 70s. Okay, so, and then they mention the centrality of the self, by which they mean that, like your point, Marianne, about, your point about age, where if where there's some maturity and more maybe determination about this is who I am, and I'm not going to go do these other things that people are asking me to do because I'm too old for that. I don't need that anymore. I don't know why I ever thought I did, that sort of thing. And your point about a notion of self-effectiveness. Exactly, yeah. And then they talk about that. And along with that, a belief in malleability or rigidity of intelligence and ability. People talk about this as, do you like new things or not? But it's also about, here's something I haven't been able to do so far. You think, could I learn to do it? Or could I not? And a lot of people think, oh no, I can't do that. And other people think, what the hell, why don't I try it? Maybe I can do it, right? And that seems to be a big factor in success. Okay, so here, those are the main points about social psychology, and let me just sort of summarize what they say. People in general think they know what others will do in specific situations, but we don't. We tend to explain things in terms of character traits but in fact they're best explained by the power of the situation, differences in construal and the manipulability of construal, the presence or absence of cultural pressure or other restraining influence, the presence of a channel to release one force in tension with others. Our ordinary methods work well enough for ordinary circumstances, for people do tend to behave in predictable ways each time they end up in the same situation. But there is, in our minds, a confounding of the power of the situation and the power of construal and these other factors. They're all at work in more or less the same way when the person is in the same situation again and again. And that's why we think we know what we're like and what other people are like. And then we are suddenly surprised by what we do and by what others do. And I bet everybody in the room has had both kinds of surprises. All right. Now, so the evidence shows that that predictability is not the result of robust, stable traits of character. And that's the basis on which Harman and Doris have argued that virtue ethics rests on a mistake. People in general don't have the sorts of traits that virtue ethics claims we should develop, because they certainly are the virtues as portrayed in traditional virtue ethics: robust, stable, broad-ranging traits of character. We think we have them, and virtue ethics refines and polishes that common thought, but the thought is an illusion. Now, I want to look at the challenges that I think are posed by situationist social psychology. And then I want to talk about how I think they should be responded to. I'll briefly mention that there are a number of responses from various philosophers to these challenges. And I'm not going to get to go into what those responses are. I won't get to talk about what I think the response should be. But I'm just classifying these challenges as, first of all, problems about the stability of character traits, which can obviously come to be problems about virtue ethics, since virtues are supposed to be stable. Problems about the rarity of virtue, if hardly anybody ever gets it, why should we think it would be something that we should or could aspire to? Problems about autonomy of action. If the situation has that much power over us, are we in fact free to choose? Problems about self-knowledge. If we don't know ourselves very well, how are we going to tell whether we're developing virtues or not? If that's the case, then we can't develop them. And problems about independence of character traits from social context. And that's the one that I like a lot, because I think it's actually pointing to a weakness in contemporary virtue ethics, but to a possible resolution as well. So here are the responses. Harman and Doris say, virtue ethics is wrong. Merritt wants to chuck Aristotelian virtue ethics out the window. She thinks Hume says that virtues are just traits that are desirable, however we come by them and whatever their cognitive content is, and that if that's all we need. And that's completely consistent with social psychology for the reasons I just mentioned, that people do behave under the right circumstances predictably. And Merritt then wants to add, virtues depend essentially on social support. Pull us out of the social support context, who knows what we will do. Several philosophers, Nancy Snow, Daniel Russell, Mark Alfano, Christian Miller are prominent among them, are attempting to develop virtue ethics one way or another, taking the results of social psychology on board. And other people like Julia Annis and quite a few other virtue ethicists say the whole thing is irrelevant. You can get what you need just by looking at the outliers. There could well have been virtuous people in every single one of these experiments. They were never unanimous results, never 100%. And maybe, well, we'll see. Now, my response is, first of all, the evidence ought to be taken seriously. It is relevant because it's a description of human nature that is very well documented. The evidence is very strong. This is what we are like, and virtue ethics isn't worth much if it doesn't in some way derive the content of ethics, not from just how people typically behave, but as an explanation of how to live a life suited to our nature in a fulfilling way. And Aristotle, scientifically oriented as he was, would have wanted to know this stuff and would have wanted to adjust his theories to what the scientists were finding out. And so I think should we. Now, how? I'm going to just run through these challenges one at a time and say what I think about them. First of all, the problem about stability of virtues. Again, the evidence does not show that there are and can be no stable virtues. It wasn't looking for virtues. The personality traits it was testing for were related to virtues, sometimes, honesty, often things like extroversion and so on, which are, psychologist personality traits but aren't virtues. And in any case, the results show average behavior, but the outliers should be taken very seriously if virtue is rare, as most virtue ethicists say that they are. Most of the experiments, very few of them are longitudinal studies, but what you would want if most of us are, if we're headed in the right direction, on the way to virtue and not fully there, is checking people out over a period of time. And if you go and look at one of these experiments, the Stanford Prison experiment, where Philip Zimbardo and his wife were very engaged with the thing, and it made a big difference in their lives, and Zimbardo looked at what he was doing and said, I don't believe it. I'm becoming a prison warden. I'm looking at things completely differently from the way I want to look at it. This that I did was immoral. I need to apologize to the people involved in this experiment, and so on. And then he and his wife have both shaped their lives from then on as a result of the experiment. So, there's one way of reading the experiment, which is throw people into these situations. Who knows what they'll do? He calls it the Lucifer effect, and then he wants an angel effect to go with it, because people also will do surprisingly wonderful things and surprise themselves and others. But at the same time, this is an example of somebody getting the wake-up call by the surprise and learning from it and becoming a different person than he otherwise would have done. Sounds a lot to me like growth in virtue. On the other hand, I don't want to dismiss this challenge too easily, because the evidence really does show that virtues are rare, that our habit of explanation by traits is often misguided, and very likely virtue ethics needs revision to match what evidence shows we are actually like. And I'm not going to try to engage in that project, but I think it's a project that ought to be carried on, and so I'm very glad to see Nancy Snow and Daniel Russell and these other folks busy doing it in different ways. The discussion is just getting started, and I think it's going to be very interesting. What about the rarity of virtue? Is that a problem? I would say it's a problem only if it means that only a few very freakish, saints and devils incarnate can have virtues or could properly aspire to them, like being an idiot savant. But if virtue is an ideal, if it's what Russell calls a status concept, which is, if you have enough of it, you count as having it, and having enough of it is not the same as having all of it that you could have, then the evidence does not show that we don't have traits like that. On the contrary, not only Zimbardo, but also Ross and Nisbet, when you look at the end of their book, the person in the situation, are obviously heading in the direction of, developing characteristics. And so is Walter Mischel, who I haven't mentioned until now, but he was the guy in 1968 who wrote this book that blew personality psychology out of the water by saying, hey, it doesn't match what you find in the experiments. So he wanted to come up with a way that combined individual cognition, motivation, and construal with the power of the situation. All right. Autonomy of action. Is the evidence a challenge to our identity as moral agents? It is a challenge. And not only, if it's a challenge to autonomy, it's a challenge not only to virtue ethics, but to any ethical theory. Because a challenge to autonomy is a challenge to our very existence as moral agents. But are we helpless in the face of unusual situations? Go back to the example of the Good Samaritan experiment. And you get, sometimes social psychologists act as if we were. So, here's Ross and Nisbet talking about the Good Samaritan experiment. And he says, they say, it replicates but amends the lesson of the Good Samaritan. Their experiment invites us to surmise that all the priests and Levites who passed by on the other side of the road, there were of course only 2 in the text, but in the experiment there were a bunch of them, were simply running behind schedule. That is, they didn't fail any moral tests. They were just doing what the situation sort of forced them to do. Jesus, I think, would not have been surprised by that explanation, but he wouldn't have bought it. And it's very clear in the text that that's not what he meant. Because, he's interacting with a questioner who says, how do I inherit eternal life? Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. And the questioner says, yeah, but who is my neighbor? And and Jesus says, tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. And then he says, which of these 3 do you think was neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? And the one who showed mercy to him. Yeah, that's right. Go do the same. Yeah.
But the priest on the way to the seminary could refute that argument by quoting the book of Abraham and saying that he was willing to gut his kid and show his love for God. And it was only by the last minute that God intervened and said, no, this plan.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. No doubt they could. And I'm not going to get into the question of the problem of evil today. I've got, as you can tell from the time, enough on my plate here. But in any case, I would say that, whatever you think of the parable or the Bible or the problem of evil, to think that this is not a moral situation is indeed a kind of compromise of our autonomy. But the fact, I think, is that, some people stopped. And I would be very interested in talking to these same seminarians and finding out what they've done since they had that wake-up call. Because I'll bet that some of them have been way more willing to drop the deadline and help anyway, because that's what the situation, understood as they understand it now, calls for from the kind of people they want to be. Okay, so I don't think that this, any challenge to autonomy is a real problem for ethics and for virtue ethics, but it's not clear to me that the evidence undermines autonomy. What it does do, though, again, is to call for very considerable humility on our part about who we are and what we're likely to do. I had to wake up when, I was I was rushing to get to a subway, and the subway just pulled out of the station right when I got to the door, and I hollered, nothing happened. I hit the window so hard, I cracked it. And I had to sit back and say, what is the problem with me? Why did I do that? I'm an angry guy inside, aren't I? I better do something about that. And with a couple of other, nice little surprise situations, I ended up actually talking to somebody for a good period of time, a counselor, who helped me work some things out. I'm freer in that respect. Enough personal stories, but you get the idea. You know, we do surprise ourselves, but that doesn't mean that the situation made us do it. It may mean there's stuff that we need to uncover and then deal with it. There's a problem about self-knowledge. Again, if there is a problem about knowing ourselves, then not only virtue, but morality itself is really challenged. And I have to say, you know, that problem has to be taken very seriously. The level of our freedom really does come into question there. There are two answers to it, though. One is that some automatic action that proceeds from, you know, below the conscious level, it has been initiated by choices we made earlier, so that, you know, we're responsible for it, even though at the time we're just doing what comes automatically. And also, we're still able to monitor and check ourselves going forward. The last point about independence from social context is what I will wrap up with. Maria Merritt's view is that dispositions to make ethically admirable choices are for the most part socially sustained in most people, even in most of us who understand ourselves as caring seriously and consistently about ethical considerations. Once we admit into reflective self-awareness a conception of such dispositions as socially sustained, we must reckon with the understanding of our own ethical character as dependent in an ongoing way and in maturity, not just during early development, upon our involvements in social life. I think that's right. And I suspect that Aristotle might have agreed with it, because at the end of a certain section in Book 3 of the Nicomachean Ethics, he says, we are ourselves, in a way, jointly responsible for our states of character, and the sort of character we have determines the sort of end we lay down. Now, it's a very strange thing for Aristotle to say at the end of that of section 5 of book 3 of the Nicomachean Ethics, because the whole section has been, or a good chunk of it has been designed to show that we are responsible for our own virtues and vices because of the choices that we have made. And yet he ends up saying this thing about we're jointly responsible. And that seems to be the best translation from what I've checked. Whether it is what he really was saying there at the end of that section, it's for sure that it's what he believes from reading the whole Nicomachean Ethics. And so collective character and individual character are interlinked for him, and they should be for us. The self is a social self. You cannot tease out the things that you have inherited from your parents, that you have soaked up from your culture. Many of them are invisible to you. You only see them when you go somewhere else into a completely different situation and you say, huh. At the same time, you are a source of influence. And this is where it comes back to the collective environmental virtues that I'm talking about, because it's not just your footprint, it's also the way you as a person influence others around you. And that is how change happens, is through influence spreading. And the social psychologists are on the same page about this. They're all about trying to create good interventions. If you think that the power of society over you is social determinism, I have to say, social determinism is a silly position. Because who is society? It's us. It's us in relationships. Now, those relationships go back for generations, and we have no control of some of the stuff that comes to us, but we do have control of what we put out, and it's only through what we put out that cultural change happens and new formative influences are passed on to the next generation. So what I'm working on is how to work that all out in connection with environmental ethics, and I've been very happy to learn about the Center for Climate Change Communication at Yale and at George Mason University, where they're working on exactly this kind of thing and breaking America down into the particular groups, with respect to denial or affirmation and how concerned you are, and figuring out strategies that will work best for communicating to everybody. I will end there, and I think we're about out of time.